Welcome to Dialogue. China has launched a 3-year campaign to reform its state-owned enterprises. The ongoing process is entering what some refer to as the deep water zone. We'll explain to you what that means. And also, we'll be exploring how will reform of the country's state-owned enterprises go, what are the reforms intended to do, and what does the 3-year plan mean for private enterprises, SMEs, and foreign investors. To discuss all these issues and more, I'm joined by Professor Liu Ke, Dean of the School of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Southern University of Science and Technology. Also by Andy Mok, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And later on by Dr. Lang Hua, President of the Far East Holding Group. That is our topic. I'm Wang Guan. Professor Liu, let me go to you first. The head of China's State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission said that China's state-owned enterprises invested over 3 trillion yuan in R&D in the past 4 years and registered a 11% year-on-year growth last year. For this year, do you expect to see more investment in research and development by SOEs? And really talk to us about the significance of investment in those areas and also the ongoing reforms of SOEs.
Yes, I believe all the SOEs going to invest more and more on R&D. As you know, the innovation is one of the key words in all the policies and all the medias in China now. So as a nation, focus more and more developing advanced technology to catch up. So both SOE as well as the private sector are going to invest more and more in R&D. That's no question about it. It's going to increase not only small but dramatically, I would expect. That's number one. And number two, if you look at the SOE in China's reform, a lot of people actually has a little bit misinterpretation or misunderstanding about the SOEs. In fact, in China, there are 2 groups of SOE. One group is, for example, the railway, China Mobile, PetroChina, Sinopec. They really maintain infrastructure, maintain your national grid, electricity, China Mobile, maintain your daily needs of society. So they're not really profit-driven. But there's also certain group of SOE. It's all SOE, but really its more accurate name is MOE, mixed owned enterprise. For example, the China Material Corporation. In fact, I met the former chairman of the CNBM yesterday, China National Material Building Group. In fact, that is a huge SOE for other people, but in reality, a lot of the secondary companies is mixed owned enterprise. A lot of actually, they acquired a lot of the private sector. So they basically use certain strengths of the SOE, but
can you give us an idea of how the percentage of this mixed ownership SOEs versus others?
Well, for example, right? For example, I just use the CNBM, China National Building Material, right? They acquired a few hundred cement companies, a private company before. They basically stayed 70%, but they give the former owner still 30%. They are still running their own company. But the CNBM overall oversee them, give them KPI, but if they make money, they still owe 30%. So I think this is a very good example of the mixed owned enterprise. And in fact, you see, after they do this reform, right, the company develops tremendously, right? I give you a number, if I recall, when Mitsui inherited this company, it's only about 2 billion RMB. But in the last year, it's about 490 billion. You get dramatic change, improve, and also you get a much better efficiency and a much better development. So I think that set a very good example for the future. Right. SOE reform. I think the MOE is the future of SOE.
Okay, MOE is the future. That is a very interesting take. Andy, let me go to you. China is completing more than 70% of all this 3-year reform plan by the end of this year, 2021. They're pushing forward what Professor Liu just mentioned, mixed ownership reforms. of those mixed ownership companies and also the reorganization of state-owned enterprises. I mean, in your opinion, what are the priorities? What should be done?
Well, I think this is a very important government initiative. So if this is a 3-year plan, as you mentioned, Wang Guan, and the first year was very challenging because of unexpected events like COVID-19. So this is a very, very crucial year. I think it's important to recognize, too, that part of what's going on here is that this idea of deep water, meaning that deep water is dangerous, one can drown in deep water, but also one wants to discover new lands. One has to leave sight of the shore, meaning travel far out to sea. And this takes a lot of courage. And I think this is a very important aspect to highlight here, that this courageous decision will result in more competitive SOEs, a stronger SOE sector in China as well. And this, of course, will have material advantages. Of course, as SOEs perform better, they'll have better products, better services, greater profitability. But I think there's also an important ideological dimension to this as well. So we've seen in the recent Texas power outage crisis what happens when you have frankly, a dishonest and boneheaded, very narrow approach to say the market has to rule everything, and we can see how disastrous that is. And I think what China is showing is that this reform of the SOE sector with mixed ownership may prove to be a much better way of approaching very, very difficult economic problems. So there is a materialist objective, and I think also an ideological opportunity as well.
Well, that's a very interesting comparative analysis there. Professor Liu, let me go back to you. The mission statement of China's 3-year reform on its state-owned enterprises are as follows. They want to optimize the structure of SOEs to make it more, quote-unquote, competitive, innovative, influential, and more able to withstand risks. I mean, that is a tall order. How do you see that happening?
I think they have to do this because, like SOE is still a bigger portion of the economy. And also, at this stage of development, they need to improve the efficiency of SOE. And also, as we know, like in China, all the major sectors like railway, all the oil industry, national grid, China Mobile, all those, they are very important to the daily life of everyone. So it's a big portion of the economy, so they have to improve the efficiency. So to do that, I believe they could gradually adopt all the rules and regulations and the way of how to manage such big corporations, just like any other multinationals. Like, for example, I used to work for General Electric for a long time. I think gradually, once you move to this mixed-owned enterprise, then all this price could be similar as those public-owned companies. For example, in fact, you look at a lot of SOE in China is already went to stock market. So now you have a lot of shareholders. Everybody can buy their stock. So I think once they have that one, once you go to a public company, then you elect all the leading talents to run this corporation, try to adopt all the policies, regulations, rules, and the system management as well as any other multinationals. I think that's the way they're going to move. They're going to learn from all the multinationals like GE, IBM, Siemens, Google. They're going to learn that gradually they're going to employ the management system, gradually make all those big SOEs become the well-run, the well-managed public company. I think that's the only way for the future reform. But of course, for certain sectors, they're really not, they cannot just only do profit-driven, because they have to maintain the society, basic needs, maintain the stable of society. So I think the good example, the former gentleman just mentioned, give example of the recent what happened in Texas, right? I think for the national grid, it's running by a big, old, stable, state-owned enterprise, which can running well, can always supply your natural gas, supply your electricity, supply your cellular system, that's a good thing. Because you can, if it's completely run by many small those private sector, then I don't think that's the right way to go. In fact, if you look at many other countries, right, those there is certain state-owned enterprise too. Even in France, right, you can see a lot of those big infrastructure owned by the national government, which is nothing wrong with that. The only thing is, I think you have to adopt all the multinationals' standard of running company, improve the efficiency. Then I think the country will develop better and better. At this stage of reform, I think they have to do this way to improve the whole economic situation of China.
Right. Professor Liu Ke, I understand you have to go. Thank you so much for your perspectives. Andy, let me go to you and really pick up on what you just said. That is this, Western neoliberal mindset, obsession with, private market mechanisms. Wherever they hear the word market, it's as if it means fairness, utmost competition, and utmost efficiency, whereas in reality, it may not necessarily be the case all the time. So how do you look at the fact that China realizes the problem, that you cannot have, SOEs too big to fail, it needs to make it leaner and meaner?
Sure. No, I think that this, again, is one of the biggest crises from the perspective of certain countries, Western countries like the United States, but also an opportunity as well. So the phrase here that comes to my mind is that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, meaning that the crisis of COVID, the crisis of the increased competition, hostility with the United States also is a very difficult time for China as well. And I think part of the SOE reform is also in response to this. And what it shows is that, Wang Guan, as you said, that in the US there's this dogma and this almost fetish that democracy, free markets are the only way and the best way to operate. And I think the challenge here is that China is showing that that is absolutely not true. And we see this broadly under the rubric of socialism with Chinese characteristics, that China's philosophy of government, its structure of government, including SOEs, mixed ownership, really have been delivering results that have surprised people all around the world, that no one thought this was possible. And I think this is, again, one of the very important aspects of what we're seeing with SOE reform.
Dr. Lang Hua, president of Far East Holding Group, is now with us. Dr. Lang, welcome to Dialogue. How do you foresee the reform of China's SOEs to go? And how would you really rate the efforts of the Chinese government's ambition and efforts to reform its SOEs this time around?
The Chinese SOE has been reformed since 1993. Hundreds of thousands of SOEs has been changed and improved. The currently 5-year action plan is very aggressive targets. A lot of efforts needs to be done. This is so-called deep water reform. That means all the low-hanging fruits have been picked up, and what is left is harder, with a higher cost, and more difficult. It kind of is the warrior, you cut off your own arms. This is not happening, say, 20 years before. The effort has been very high, and the target has been very aggressive. So hopefully, there's a good results after 3 years.
Yeah, you have been in the energy industry for quite a while, how would you advise the government to go about doing this? I mean, what sectors or industries should be given priorities in this round of reforms?
The truly competitive markets has been kind of mixed with the SOE and private and multinationals. In energy sector and other fields has been opened up. railways, transportations, new energies. This provides opportunities for private sectors as well as the FDA. What I suggest is kind of two-way reform. One is to, for SOE, attract the strategic investors. What happened before is kind of focus on the equity structure. You have a joint venture, etc. But the reform phase 2.0, I would say we are involve strategic investors. That means not only to participate corporate governance, but also will participate in the operations. And so reform 1.0 is more on the solid side, and this stage is more on the soft side. So this is one way to the SOE to attract the even the private sectors. Another one is for SOE also to participate the development of other sectors, including private companies and the multinationals. So the two-way reform is a new phase for next 3 years.
Yeah. Do you foresee this round of SOE reforms, lead to massive layoffs? Back in the 90s, remember that the reforms led to massive layoffs. Many of my friends and their families members, got unemployed.
I don't think so. Not a chapter has passed. This one will be more focused on the technological innovation and the improvement of the supply chain instead of focus on the labor efficiency. That's what happened in the phase 1. And this one will be the two parties, the partners will work together, improve the technology, and be more innovative and more agile and the operations instead of calculate the cost per head counts, etc. So I will not believe there's a massive layoffs or downsize for all the partners.
Right, Andy, let's talk about the global perspective here and take up some Western perspective here. There has been lots of complaints about the Chinese government's so-called subsidies to SOEs, which I'm sure do happen. On one hand, these foreign governments are complaining about Chinese subsidies to SOEs, but on the other hand, they're really happy to see these Chinese SOEs purchase, American soybeans and farm produce in the phase 1 U.S.-China trade deal. How do you see this dichotomy?
Sure. Well, I think that this is really a process of recalibration that we're witnessing. So the world has lived, certainly at least since World War II, under a Western liberal order. I would not call it an international liberal order because that leaves out probably most of the world's population, but under a Western liberal order where, again, the ideals of free market, quote-unquote free market competition were worshipped and elevated to, a kind of sacrosanct law. And this is where I think some of these criticisms of SOE subsidies are coming from. But when we look at it from a more rational and objective perspective, what has China achieved, certainly since '78, with this kind of structure where there are private enterprises, SMEs, but there also is a very important and frankly quite vital SOE sector as well that has functioned as it has in the Chinese system with subsidies, with other aspects that some Western governments and businesses find objectionable. And I think where we're coming out or where we're heading is that first of all, where you stand depends on where you sit, meaning your views depend on what your economic interests are. So if you're a publicly listed corporation or a Western government that is very supportive of your country's publicly listed companies, of course you're going to be against subsidies. But I think from a more rational perspective, more observant and more objective people are recognizing that, in fact, subsidies are not bad. The Chinese way of doing things actually is very effective. Doesn't mean that it should be done everywhere around the world, but certainly it is a legitimate and proven way of growing an economy, lifting people out of poverty, maintaining social stability. So I think that some of these criticisms will never go away, but I think the rationale behind them is increasingly becoming weakened. So we'll see what happens going forward.
Right. Dr. Long, let me go to you. A lot of our viewers are overseas, outside China. So for them, a question they're really asking is, what will this round of Chinese SOE reforms mean for foreign businesses and multinationals, multinational companies operating in China?
As I said before, that's the door opened, wide open today for the market access. For example, if you set up joint venture in certain industry sectors, there's no limitations on the equity shares. That's number one. Even for the procurement, there's more transparency. So in the foreign companies, they will have a transparency to say the purchase of products and the service. Additionally, the kind of the dual circulation of the Chinese economy, and also open the door and provide all opportunities for them to catch it. So the market access is the biggest win for this kind of reform.
Right. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about China-EU investment deal, the talks of which has been concluded, but the deal itself is yet to be signed or ratified by Beijing or Brussels. So Andy, let me go back to you. How do you expect the China-EU trade deal, investment deal rather, when it is ratified and signed, will affect the reform of China's SOEs?
Well, I think you're right, Wang Guan. So I think the big question mark at this point is ratification by the EU Parliament, and certainly there are people in Europe that are very, very opposed to this. My hope is that rationality and the opportunities for a more prosperous and stable future for Europe will win out, and the treaty will be signed. I think the Chinese side has been consistent and very clear that as long as it's on a basis of mutual respect and equality, that whether it's the EU, whether it's the United States, whether it's other countries, that China is ready to work with any country on that basis. I do want to go back, though, to what this might mean from an SOE perspective and with foreign businesses. I think, honestly, it will be a blessing and a curse, meaning that when we look at SOE reform at the firm level, what this means is SOEs will become more competitive through greater efficiency as well as investment in R&D. So this means if you're competing against the Chinese SOE, whether in China or elsewhere in the world, a much tougher competitor. But on the positive side, as Chinese SOEs become increasingly competitive, they're going to be looking for best-in-class suppliers, partners, and then this will be a market opportunity for European companies, for American companies, companies everywhere around the world. And I think overall, this will be a benefit to China, it will be a benefit to the world, because we do live in a world with limited resources, and when we can do more with less, everyone wins. And China's SOEs, of course, we know, are an important part of its economy and will continue to be an important part of its economy. So the better this sector does, I think the better for everyone. The other thing I want to quickly add, too, is not just at a firm level, but at a system level, we're also witnessing mergers, consolidations, and what this is doing is reducing redundancy, which again can be a positive for foreign businesses that are suppliers to these companies, as they're easier to work with, bigger companies, bigger demand, but they could also be more competitive as well.
Dr. Lang, how do you see this China-EU investment deal, and really what would that mean for China's SOEs?
We have been very active for the European markets. Even today, we have probably 3 opportunities we are working on to cooperate with the European companies. Before, there's some kind of constraints for us to do, the certain things which is not necessary. So after the EU deal done, and the benefits has been widely appreciated. So I have been approached by the few opportunities from Europe, so what we can do together. This is the kind of the benefits of the deal. On the other side, for me, it's the private sector, and for SOE is also improve kind of the governance and how the SOE to increase its own competitiveness. For example, I just mentioned some of the transparency requirements there, and they say subsidize. Every country is subsidized, but the only thing is transparency. So on the European side, we welcome the final closure of the China-EU agreement, and we are anticipating the more kind of opportunities down the road.
Yeah, Dr. Long, China is also saying that it is actively considering joining the CPTPP, which has, as many experts pointed out, much tougher requirements on SOEs. Do you think this current round of SOE reforms in China will be sufficient to meet those requirements?
I would say not fully sufficient, but it is a stepping stone after China-EU agreement. There's a few critical requirements here. One is kind of the commercial, non-discriminatory kind of a decision for the purchase of products and service. Number two is the information sharing for the assessment in certain decision makings. Number three is the kind of a dispute resolution mechanism by investment committees. So all those ones will be part of the CPTPP. But if there's some agreements reached already, and the China-EU deal, will be much easier to negotiate with the CPTPP.
Well, Andy, do you have anything to add when it comes to this trade deals and their opportunities for China's SOEs?
Well, I think SOE reform is not static. As Dr. Long mentioned, what was necessary and was achieved in the 90s is no longer sufficient for today. So I think 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I think what I feel confident about is that the Chinese system will endure, but it will also evolve. And the demands placed on individual SOEs as well as SOEs as a sector will also change. Clearly, we see a number of challenges from public health, climate change, geopolitical realignments. These are all very, very powerful forces that every sector of the economy will have to deal with, and I think this will also affect the SOE sector in China as well.
All right, Andy, Senior Research Fellow at Center for China and Globalization, Dr. Long, thank you both very much, and also Professor Liu Ke with us earlier. Thank you all for being part of today's discussion. And that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing.